Here's an interview with Don Driscoll, Professor of Terrestrial Ecology at Deakin University. I'm just going to put up some images of a walk I did in 2022 with a few friends doing the Australian Alps walking track, just for a bit of interest. It was a walk from Canberra to Melbourne through the high country. It took us 5 weeks. Fantastic walk. This is an interview about Kosciuszko National Park and the threat faced by climate change and feral and introduced animals. But before I start, have a look at this photo. This was taken by Roland in the Glenbog State Forest on top of the Brown Mountain on the 6th of November 2022. It's an amazing photo. Okay, that's recording. So Don, would you just mind telling me how you'd like to be introduced?
So it's Don Driscoll, Professor of Terrestrial Ecology at Deakin University.
And you've certainly had a fair bit to say about Kosciuszko National Park. Don, my interest in this radio show really comes out of climate change. I've been really concerned about the impact of climate change on the Kosciuszko National Park. I wonder if we could start there.
Sure.
How do you feel about Kosciuszko as how robust is the ecosystem in the Kosciuszko National Park, and is it under threat from climate change?
Well, yeah, our highest mountain ecosystems are certainly under threat from climate change, and there are two sort of main aspects driving that. So that's just the increasing temperatures, so changing the local environments that shifts it outside of the range that species are adapted to.
Mm-hmm.
And the other big impact is going to be changing fire regimes. So I've already seen a number of very large fires go through the alpine country of New South Wales and Victoria over the last couple of decades. And prior to that, there was one fire, like the 1939 sort of fires. So there's definitely an increasing trend, a very concerning trend, to having more frequent fire, and that's not good news for the alpine ecosystems, which they can cope with 1 or 2 fires every century or so, but multiple fires within a decade or two is really damaging to those ecosystems.
So we've seen big fires, 2003, Kosciuszko National Park, and in the Black Summer fires. So 2 big fires. Is there a climate signal there? Do you think those fires are more intense and more frequent because of climate change? Are we already seeing that signal?
Yeah, definitely. The research after the 2019-20 fires shows that there's a clear signal of climate change in that. And the other alpine fires, so the big fires in 2003 and 2006 as well,
mm-hmm.
in the Alps in Victoria. And there's just no historic precedent for that. So it aligns totally with the predictions from climate change that we're going to get more frequent severe fire weather, and that's going to bring more frequent and large fires.
Mm-hmm. What do you think Kosciuszko National Park is going to look like in 10 or 20 years' time with these more frequent fires? How's that going to impact on the Kosciuszko National Park?
Well, it's going to change the ecosystem. So when we get those fires in really dry conditions, so like in 2019-20, just after a long drought, the ecosystems that are normally wet and don't burn much, like the peat bogs, they burn a lot. So we're going to lose a lot of our peat bogs and the carbon that they store there. But it also depends a bit on how resilient the ecosystems are when these fires come through.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the way the land is being managed at the moment comes into question, because if they're under pressures from feral herbivores like horses and deer, then they're going to be less resilient to these changes associated with climate change.
I wonder if we could just expand on that there, Don. I know cattle grazing was stopped in New South Wales quite a few years ago, and more recently in Victoria as well. How was the cattlemen say that grazing reduces blazing? Is there any basis to that statement?
Well, it seems to be based on the sort of coincidence of ecosystems that are flammable and aren't flammable, and where cattle graze. So cattle will graze up on the snow grass, up in the open grassy ecosystems, and those snow grasses are not the most flammable plants. So the fires that run through the Alps are mainly driven by the shrubby ecosystems and the areas with woody ecosystems, whereas the cattle tend to hang out in the grassy areas where fire doesn't carry that fast or severe. So if you were a cattleman hanging around in the high country, you would make the casual observation that the fire seemed to peter out when it got to where my cows are, but it would have petered out anyway, just because those poa grasslands are one of the less flammable ecosystems up there.
Mm-hmm. And what about other herbivores, as you mentioned, deers and horses? How do they impact fire behaviour?
Yeah, so I'm not sure how they impact fire behaviour. Potentially not very much. We saw, because climate change is bringing such extreme weather, the more extreme the weather is, the less important the amount of fuel is in the fire equation. So people reported after the Canberra fires that the fires burnt essentially across bare paddocks because it was so hot and so dry that the fire was able to carry across this virtually fuelless landscape. So the big attention that people say people pay the fuel loads is actually misdirected, because the critical aspect is the extreme weather. So my expectation is that the feral animals, they'll change the intensity of a fire at a particular spot by taking away the grass, particularly in those dry periods. It's not going to make any difference to the carry of the fire, and it's not going to make any difference to how safe people are in their houses outside of national parks. The thing that these feral herbivores do is reduce the resilience of those ecosystems to fire and other disturbances and other invasive animals like the predators. And we think that's one of the key ways that feral herbivores are causing animals like the broad-toothed rat to decline, because they take away the vegetation that broad-toothed rats live in, and that exposes them to foxes and cats, and they just can't survive when they've got nowhere to hide.
Mm-hmm. So if we're getting more onto the subject of brumbies, a pretty hot topic, Don, and certainly my post last week when I interviewed Dr. Stuart Cairns about counting brumbies in the high country got a lot of interest and a fair bit of negative interest, I have to say. And I'd love to talk to you, Don, about the number of wild horses in the high country. What's your opinion about Dr. Stuart Cairns and the way that he's counted brumbies, and what's your feeling about the number of wild horses in the high country?
Look, the way the horses have been surveyed is using the best approach that we have. So it's using distance measures. So the further away a bunch of horses are, the less likely they are to be detected. So you've got to take that into account in your surveys. This is standard scientific protocol for doing surveys like this. So the method they're using is tried and true, and the numbers they're coming up with, both truly worrying, but they come with a confidence interval. So although Stuart's latest surveys in 2022 suggest there's 18,000, roughly around 18,000 horses. There's also a range, so it's somewhere between 14,000 and 23,000. So there is uncertainty in the estimate, but it's the numbers are still high. They've still increased in the last 2 years since the last survey.
Yep.
And the impacts on the ecosystems are still enormous, and that's the critical thing. So it's not so much how many horses there are, it's whether or not the horses that are there are causing damage to the ecosystem. And you can still just, you don't need to be an ecologist to walk through that high country up there and see that the ecosystems are being really smashed by these feral herbivores.
I want to talk to you about the damage done in a moment, Don. A couple of the Brumby supporters have pointed out some numbers that you've posted, talking about 57,000 horses by 2023. Can you explain that number? That does seem like a high number to me.
Yeah, so the numbers that they're now using out of context was an extrapolation showing what could happen if there was no horse control at all, and horse numbers continued to increase at the rate that they had been. So the most recent estimates of that horse numbers are increasing at around 17% per year, and it's like compound interest. So you add 17% to the current numbers, and then you add another 17% to the current numbers plus this year's 17%. Yep. So the numbers increase exponentially, and you can end up with enormous numbers. And that's why we're in this terrible situation that we are now. It's because horses weren't controlled when there were smaller numbers, and they've just increased enormously at that 17% per year. And now we've got around 18,000.
Yeah. Certainly from my individual experience, and it's very hard as a single person basing numbers on individual observation, and I couldn't hope to answer how many questions there are, how many horses there are in the Kosciuszko National Park, but it's very clear to my observation that the numbers are increasing dramatically. The first wild horse I saw was in 1978 around Cascades Hut. Beautiful grey stallion appeared out of the mist. That was the first time I'd actually heard of a horse being seen. And now, if you go back to Cascades Hut, you'll probably see 50 horses in the river valley there. So I would like to talk to you about your observations about the damage that feral animals do. And I know there's lots of different feral animals. There's pigs, deers, dogs, foxes, cats, and horses. What sort of damage do the wild horses do in the high country, Don?
Yeah, so the feral horses up there will, they eat grass, so they reduce the amount of grass and drive that down to quite a very low level, especially in the dry years. And as I was saying before, that exposes any animals that are living in the grass to predators. But horses also need to drink, and they need to do that every day. And they've caused enormous damage to the endangered alpine bog and fen communities. So these are listed endangered communities, and they're really being destroyed by the feral horses up there, because the horses they'll walk into them. They eat all the vegetation along the banks, which exposes them to erosion. That causes siltation, and just the horses being in the streams cause siltation. And that still is actually a real problem for some of the species there. So there's the endangered fish that only lives in Kosciuszko National Park, and it lays its eggs amongst the rocks in the streams. And if those little gaps between the rocks are filled in with silt, the habitat is no longer suitable for them to reproduce. So it has really big implications, the sort of damage they're doing. The horses will create pathways through these bogs, and that allows the water to flow faster, and that leads to erosion and draining of the bog. So the outer edges of the bog start to dry out, and once that peaty soil dries out, it starts to lose the carbon that it's absorbed. So the ecosystem's degrading, and it's worsening climate change by releasing that stored carbon.
So can I ask you, Don, I've done a lot of walking in the Kosciuszko National Park, and I've been through areas where the brumby population seems pretty sparse, and other areas where it's just plainly too many horses. I have to say, in areas where there's been relatively low density, I think to me it seems like the park can cope reasonably well. Can I ask you, Don, is the park able to cope with any wild horses in it? What do you think about that?
So the only research I'm aware of that has addressed the effects of low density of horses comes from the Bogong High Plains, and that showed that even with around 100 animals across that Bogong High Plains, so relatively low density, the damage to the bogs still accumulated. And that's because these high elevation ecosystems, they exist under very cold conditions, so they're very slow to recover. The growth season is short, and because the temperatures are low, plants don't grow very fast. So they take a long time to recover once the pressures are removed. But even with a very low amount of pressure, that can prevent them from recovering. So the evidence that we've got so far is that even very low numbers of horses is going to continue to degrade these sensitive alpine communities. But I mean, let's think about what a national park is for. A national park is supposed to be for protecting native Australian species. It's supposed to protect our Australian ecosystems. And those alpine ecosystems and the specialised species that live in them, both plants and animals, they occur nowhere else on the planet. So it's a very small area of Australia where these species exist and that they depend on. Contrast that with feral horses, and you find feral horses across the entire country and in other countries. They're genetically the same as horses that are found across farms around the country. So it doesn't really stack up. Why would we compromise the conservation of Australian native species that only live in this tiny area in the Alps to favour a feral animal that occurs across the entire country?
Yeah, I did a Google search on feral horses in Australia, Don, and the answer was 400,000 horses, wild horses, mainly in Northern Territory and Queensland. I just wonder why they need to be protected in such a pristine place as the Kosciuszko National Park. It doesn't make sense.
No, it's a good question. And the 400,000 number is certainly a gross underestimate. It's a number that was roughly estimated and published in a paper, I think maybe in the 70s, like a long, long time ago. It's a very old estimate. And there are no more recent estimates, so that's why that number persists. But I'd be pretty confident in saying there's many, many more horses across the country than 400,000.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware, Don, of a national park anywhere where an introduced species is protected?
No, it's unique to New South Wales. It's a sad legacy of John Barilaro, that when he was deputy leader of the government, and I think it's sad that the current New South Wales government have managed to repeal it. It's a crazy law protecting feral animals above native species and ecosystems.
Mm-hmm. So, Don, what do you think should be done about feral animals in Kosciuszko National Park? What's the best way to control them?
The most humane and effective way to control feral horses is to cull them. And aerial culling is when it's implemented under appropriate animal welfare conditions, it is a humane way to take out the horses, and I think that's critical, and that's now been recognised. So both Victoria and New South Wales are now able to use aerial culling to manage horses, and it's used widely around the country as well. So other states already use aerial culling to manage feral horses, and so it's not actually an extremely controversial or radical way of managing this problem. New South Wales and Victoria already use it for managing deer and pigs. So adding this other larger feral herbivore just makes sense.
Mm. I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, Don, but the ACT has a zero tolerance towards wild horses, and they're all shot in the ACT, I believe. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yep. The ACT don't tolerate horses coming over from New South Wales, and that's really protected in the Imagine National Park and the Brindabella Range, so that they've got quite good quality alpine ecosystems because of that zero tolerance approach.
Uh-huh. So, look, thanks very much for your time this morning, Don. Can I just ask you a couple of more questions? A lot of the Brumby supporters are talking about a comment you've made about horses being cannibals. I wonder if you could clarify that comment.
Yeah, so this is actually an experience that got me interested in the feral horse issue. Back in 2014, when I was on a trip with a colleague from ANU, and we found a dead horse lying on the ground, and there were two other horses standing around nibbling around the edge of its open body cavity. So we clearly saw that sort of minor act of cannibalism. Mm-hmm. I've had a look into whether this has occurred elsewhere, and I have seen a report where horses were left unattended in a paddock in the USA, and there was some report of cannibalism there as well. So it's not unprecedented, but certainly unusual, but also largely irrelevant to the current fiasco going on in Kosciuszko National Park, where there are simply too many horses, and they have to be removed to protect the national park. Mm.
And what's your thinking about rehoming as a solution for wild horses?
Well, there are a range of other aspects that could potentially contribute, but there are 18,000 horses in the national park this year. Yeah. Last year with last year's the 2022 survey, and so there's going to be more now, depending on how the culling's going up there. So you just can't rehome that many horses. You can't the rate of increase is about 17%. So past calculations that I've made says that's about 3,000 horses per year getting added to the population. There just aren't that many homes per year to reverse the growth rate of the feral horses. So while it's fine if the government want to invest in this costly way of managing sort of some of the social aspects of feral horse control, then I think that's up to them, and it's great for people who want to get a horse and have the capacity to train it and look after it. But it's never going to contribute to actually controlling numbers in the alpine national parks.
And Don, one final question. I'm just wanting some clarification from some comments that the Brumby supporters have made. You're talking about an annual increase of 17 or 18% in terms of wild horse numbers. The Brumby supporters say that rate of increase is biologically impossible. How do you respond to that?
Well, the rate of increase was calculated based on the aerial surveys that have been undertaken, and they So those aerial surveys are providing the best estimates that we have, and claiming that it's biologically possible is sort of a cheap shot at the pretty solid science that's coming out of the survey data. The literature says that horse populations will typically increase at around 20%. There's even records of them increasing at around 30%, so it's certainly biologically possible.
Mm-hmm. And just before you go, Don, there was another count done, organised. The Brumby supporters did some crowdfunding, managed to raise, I think, about $80,000 and did an aerial survey of an area of the northern park, did a photographic survey looking at 212 square kilometres of the northern part of the park, finding lower numbers than what national parks suggest. Have you had a look at that study?
I haven't seen the details of that study at this stage, but because they're not using a distance, they're not adjusting for the likelihood that you detect them less often the further away they are. They're almost certainly going to get an underestimate. I mean, if you're just taking aerial photography, looking straight down, you're only going to be able to count the number that you can see. You won't be able to count the ones that are hidden in trees. So it's certainly going to give an underestimate. Look, I was involved in a kangaroo count some years ago in the ACT, and we walked through this nature reserve, driving kangaroos one way and counting them as they ran back between us. And my own impression of how many animals were there turned out to be about half the number that were actually there. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to get a sort of gut feel for how many animals are present just by walking around or riding around yourself through the landscape. You really have to go through that scientific process of using those tried and true approaches of distance sampling to get a good estimate of how many are there.
Don, thanks very much for your time today. Getting into this pretty hot topic. Lots of vigorous discussion and some pretty heated discussion too. But thank you very much for giving us a scientific perspective on what's happening in the Kosciuszko National Park.
It's been my pleasure, and we definitely need to give a lot of weight to the scientific evidence around the numbers and around how to manage the horses. Mm-hmm.
Don, thanks so much. That's fantastic. I might send you a copy of that if you want.
Yep, that'd be good.
Fantastic. And I'll put it out on Facebook, and it's bound to stir up some more people. It's like poking a hornet's nest, this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Don.
Yep, good talking to you.
Champion. Good on you. See ya.